April 16th, 1945. A cellar beneath a shattered farmhouse near Iserlohn, Germany. The world had shrunk to the smell of damp earth, stale sweat, and fear. For 3 days, this had been their universe. Above, the war raged, but the sounds were changing. The familiar, frantic crack of their own MG-42s had gone silent yesterday. The guttural roar of the panzers had been replaced by a deeper, more rhythmic grinding, the sound of American steel. It was the sound of the end. Lena, at 20 years old, a veteran of a war she no longer understood, pressed her ear against the cold stone. She was a Nachrichtenhelferin, a signals auxiliary. Her job was to connect voices, to weave the web of command that held the front together. Now the web was torn to shreds, and there were no more voices to connect, only silence and the approaching grind of the M4 Sherman tanks of the U.S. 9th Infantry Division. Beside her, 17-year-old Ingrid coughed, a dry, rasping sound that echoed too loudly in the cramped space. There were 6 of them in total, all women of the Helferinnen Corps, their gray uniforms smudged with dirt and plaster dust. They had a single Mauser Kar 98K rifle between them, with 5 rounds, a useless token of defiance. Lena looked at the rifle, then at the pale, hollowed faces around her. They were taught that surrender was a betrayal. Propaganda films showed leering, monstrous American soldiers, savages who would do unspeakable things. But the gnawing emptiness in her stomach argued differently. Hunger was a more immediate monster. Their last proper meal had been a thin stew of foraged potatoes 4 days ago. Since then, nothing. The grinding stopped directly overhead. Dust sifted down from the ceiling boards. Heavy footfalls thumped on the floor above, followed by loud, foreign voices. English. The language sounded lazy, confident, utterly alien. Ingrid whimpered, clutching Lena's arm. "They will kill us," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Just like the poster said." Lena put a finger to her lips, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could feel the vibrations through the floor. Men moving, checking the ruins. A heavy object was dragged across the floorboards. Then a splintering crash. Light, blinding and cruel, lanced into their tomb. A silhouette stood in the shattered opening, a helmet and the distinctive shape of an M1 Garand rifle outlined against the gray sky. "Anybody down there?" The voice was young, tinged with an accent from a place Lena couldn't imagine. Ohio, perhaps, or Kansas. A world away. Silence was their only answer. Lena held her breath, praying they would be overlooked, that the soldiers would move on. But you are not so lucky. The silence stretches, taut and humming with tension. Then the unmistakable metallic clank of a grenade pin being pulled. "Last chance. Come on out, or we're clearing it the hard way." The words were a threat, but the tone was almost weary, as if this was a chore he'd performed 100 times. Panic flared in the cellar. One of the older women, Greta, began to sob quietly. Lena knew in that instant there was no choice. Dying for a lost cause was one thing. Dying in a dark hole from a grenade, hungry and terrified, was another. It was a pointless, pathetic end. She took a deep breath, the dusty air scraping her raw throat. "Don't shoot," she called out, her own voice sounding thin and strange. "We are coming out. We are women, unarmed." She shoved the useless rifle away from them. "Come and see Rouse. Hands a hole," the American voice barked back. Hands up. Lena pushed Ingrid behind her slightly, a uselessly protective gesture. One by one, they climbed the debris-strewn steps into the daylight. The light was merciless. It exposed their filth, their sunken eyes, the trembling in their hands. A squad of American soldiers surrounded them, their rifles held at a low ready. They looked impossibly large, well-fed, their uniforms caked in mud, but not yet worn to rags. They were young, most of them no older than Lena herself, but their eyes held a hardness that spoke of places like the Hurtgen Forest and the Remagen Bridge. For a moment, no one moved. The Americans stared, a flicker of surprise on their faces at finding women instead of battle-hardened soldiers. Lena stared back, waiting for the blow, the shove, the violence she had been promised. But it didn't come. Instead, a sergeant with tired eyes and a smear of grease on his cheek simply jerked his head to the west. "Get him back to the collection point," he said, his voice flat. "There's someone else's problem now." The march began, away from the rubble of their last post, and into a future more terrifying than any battle.
The collection point was a muddy field that had once grown sugar beets. Now it grew prisoners, thousands of them. Lena and her small group were herded through a break in a hastily erected barbed wire fence, joining a vast gray sea of defeated men. There were boys who looked no older than 14, their faces still round with youth, swimming in oversized uniforms. There were old men of the Volkssturm, their backs bent, their eyes vacant with the shock of their world's collapse. Interspersed were the hard-bitten veterans of the Wehrmacht and what was left of the SS, their defiance a brittle shell that was visibly cracking under the weight of total defeat. The women were an anomaly, drawing curious, sometimes resentful stares from their own countrymen. They huddled together, a small island in the swirling tide of surrender. The sheer scale of it all was suffocating. As far as the eye could see, columns of German soldiers snaked across the landscape, disarmed and shuffling towards similar enclosures. The guards, GIs from the 9th Infantry, seemed overwhelmed by the numbers, their movements efficient but strained. They were not cruel, but they were impersonal. They were processing a product, and that product was the remnants of the German army. For the first 2 days in the enclosure, there was no food. The American supply lines were stretched to their breaking point, focused on fueling the armored spearheads still driving deep into the heart of Germany. The prisoners were an afterthought, a logistical nightmare to be dealt with later. The hunger that had been a dull ache in the cellar now became a sharp, twisting agony. It consumed every thought, turning the world into a hazy, dreamlike state, punctuated by the intense cramping of an empty stomach. You could smell the Americans. They smelled of soap, of coffee, of engine oil, and something else, the faint, sweet scent of processed food. They moved with a purpose Lena's own people had lost. GMC trucks, the famous deuce and a halves, rumbled past on the nearby road, an endless convoy carrying the fuel and ammunition of a victorious army. The prisoners would watch them pass, their faces blank. Each truck was a reminder of what they lacked, of the industrial might that had ground them into the mud. On the 3rd day, a water truck arrived, and the prisoners surged forward, a desperate, pathetic mob. The guards shouted, brandishing their rifles to maintain order. Lena managed to get their canteen filled, the chlorinated water tasting metallic and strange, but it was something. It quieted the thirst, but did nothing for the gnawing void inside. Later that afternoon, a field kitchen was set up, not for them, but for the American guards. The smell that drifted over the barbed wire was torture. It was the smell of frying meat, of onions, of brewing coffee. It was a scent from another lifetime, a life of warm kitchens and full plates. Ingrid began to weep silently, her thin shoulders shaking. "I can't, Lena," she choked out. "I can't stand it." Lena pulled the younger girl close, offering what little comfort she could. But the smell was insidious. It bypassed reason and spoke directly to the most primal part of the brain. It promised life, warmth, an end to the suffering. The GIs lined up with their mess kits, laughing and talking as they were served. They ate with a casualness that was infuriating, sometimes not even finishing their portions, scraping the leftovers into a garbage can. To the starving prisoners, that garbage can was a treasure chest. Lena watched a grizzled Oberlieutenant, a man who probably had an iron cross pinned to his uniform under his greatcoat, stare at the can with an intensity that was terrifying. His pride, his discipline, his entire identity as a German officer was at war with the animal instinct to crawl over there and fight for a half-eaten piece of bread. This was the true defeat, Lena realized, not the lost battles or the surrendered territory. It was this stripping away of dignity, this reduction to pure, desperate need. She watched the American sergeant from her capture, the one with the tired eyes, sit on the hood of a jeep, eating something from a piece of wax paper. He ate slowly, methodically. He wasn't gloating. He was just a man eating his dinner. But to Lena, he was a king at a banquet, and she was a beggar at the gates, smelling the feast and slowly starving to death. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the field of misery. The air grew cold, and the hunger pit even deeper. It was in that moment, watching the sergeant crumple his wax paper and toss it aside, that a desperate, terrifying idea began to form in Lena's mind. The idea was madness. It was a violation of every instinct for self-preservation she had left, a final surrender of the one thing they still possessed, their pride. But as night fell over the makeshift prison camp, and the cold April air settled deep into their bones, pride felt like a distant luxury. The reality was Ingrid, shivering uncontrollably beside her, her breathing shallow. The girl hadn't spoken in hours, her eyes glazed over, fixed on the distant, glowing embers of the American cook fire. Hunger was no longer an ache, it was a poison, slowly shutting down her body. Lena knew, with a chilling certainty, that if they didn't get some real food soon, Ingrid might not survive another night.
The thought cut through her fear like a shard of glass. She looked around at the other prisoners. They were ghosts, wraiths wrapped in filthy field-gray coats, their faces skeletal in the dim light. They had accepted their fate. They would sit here and waste away, too broken or too proud to beg. But Lena was 20, and she was responsible for the 17-year-old girl fading away next to her. That responsibility was a heavy, anchoring weight, a final duty in a world where all other duties had dissolved into chaos. The Americans were cleaning up their mess kits now, the clatter of metal on metal echoing across the field. They were dumping coffee grounds, scraping plates into the bin. Each sound was a torment. "I'm going over there," Lena said, her voice a harsh whisper. The other women in her small group stared at her as if she had announced she was going to fly. "Lena, no," whispered Greta. "They'll hurt you, or worse. You heard the stories." "The stories are just stories," Lena shot back, though her own heart was pounding with the truth of the propaganda she'd been fed for years. Ingrid is real. Her hunger is real. She looked down at the girl, who didn't even seem to hear them. Lena's resolve hardened. She would trade her pride for Ingrid's life. It was not a difficult choice to make. Getting up felt like lifting a mountain. Her legs were weak, trembling not just from hunger but from sheer terror. She smoothed down her tunic, a pointless gesture of neatness in the midst of squalor. She began to walk towards the wire, towards the light of the American camp. With every step, she felt the eyes of thousands of her countrymen on her back. Their silence was a heavy blanket of judgment and pity. They were watching her do what they could not bring themselves to do. She reached the perimeter wire, a flimsy barrier that separated two different worlds. On the other side, the GIs looked up, their conversations tapering off. They saw her, a lone German woman, standing at the edge of their world. Her target was the sergeant she recognized. He was talking to another soldier, a corporal, leaning against a jeep. He had a face that looked like it belonged on a farm, open and weary. He wasn't a monster. He was just a man. But he wore the uniform of the enemy, and he held all the power. Lena's mind raced, trying to string together the few English words she knew, words learned from a schoolbook in a time before the bombs fell. The phrases felt clumsy and stupid in her head. She took another deep breath, the cold air burning her lungs. This was it. The ultimate degradation. A German woman, begging from the invaders. She pushed aside the shame, focusing on Ingrid's pale face in her mind's eye. She raised a hand, not in a salute, but in a small, hesitant gesture to get the sergeant's attention. He saw her. His conversation stopped. He straightened up from the jeep, his expression unreadable. He and the corporal exchanged a look. For a heart-stopping moment, Lena thought he would turn away, or worse, laugh. The entire camp seemed to hold its breath, watching this small, silent drama unfold. The sergeant took a few steps toward her, stopping a safe distance from the wire. He folded his arms. "Yeah?" he asked. The single word hung in the air, a challenge and a question. It was her turn. Lena's throat was dry as dust. She swallowed hard, the sound loud in her own ears. Her carefully rehearsed words flew out of her head, leaving only the raw, desperate need.
Lena's lips parted, but only a dry click emerged. The sergeant, Frank Miller of Cleveland, Ohio, waited. His posture was wary, his hand resting near the Colt M1911 pistol on his hip. He'd seen desperate people do desperate things, but this was different. The woman wasn't defiant, she wasn't angry, she was just broken. Her gray uniform hung off her skeletal frame, and her eyes, wide and dark in a face smudged with dirt, held a terrifying emptiness he'd seen too many times before. He saw his own younger sister in her face for a fleeting, uncomfortable second. Finally, she found her voice. It was a reedy whisper, barely carrying across the few yards of mud that separated them. "Please," she began, the English word clumsy on her tongue. "Sir?" She stumbled over the next words, gesturing vaguely back toward the darkness where the other women were hidden. "The leftovers from your food? Can we have?" She couldn't bring herself to say the word scraps. Leftovers felt infinitesimally more dignified. She pointed a trembling finger at the garbage can, where the cook was about to dump a pail of coffee grounds. Her request hung in the cold night air, an admission of utter defeat. She braced herself for the expected response, a bark of laughter, a curt dismissal, a shove. Propaganda had prepared her for cruelty, for contempt. It had not prepared her for the silence that followed. Sergeant Miller didn't laugh. He looked from her face to the garbage can and then back. He saw the flicker of hope and terror in her eyes. He saw the way she held herself, rigid with a pride that was costing her everything to sacrifice.
He'd been fighting for almost a year, from the hedgerows of Normandy to the frozen hell of the Ardennes. He was tired of death. He was tired of hate. He was 1,000,000 miles from home, and all he wanted was for the whole damned war to be over. He looked at this starving woman, and he didn't see a Nazi or an enemy. He saw a human being who was hungry. It was as simple and as complicated as that. He turned to the corporal beside him. "What do we have left, Smitty?" he asked, his voice low. The cook, a heavy-set man named Smitty from Arkansas, overheard and grumbled. "Nothing but some burgers for the night watch, Sarge. We ain't running a charity for the Krauts." Miller's gaze hardened slightly. "Just make 2 more plates, Smitty, now." The cook grumbled again, but knew better than to argue with that tone in the sergeant's voice. He disappeared into the kitchen tent. Lena watched this exchange, understanding none of the words, but all of the meaning. Something was happening, something she hadn't anticipated. She remained frozen at the wire, her fists clenched at her sides. Was this a game? A new, crueler form of torture? Smitty emerged from the tent a few moments later with 2 steaming mess kits. Miller took them. He walked to the wire and knelt, pushing them carefully under the bottom strand. Lena stared at the plates. They weren't scraps. They were full meals. On each plate sat a hamburger patty nestled between 2 thick slices of white bread. Beside it was a scoop of fried potatoes and onions. The smell was overwhelming, a rich, savory aroma that made her stomach clench with a pain that was half hunger and half pure disbelief. This could not be real. Food like this didn't exist anymore. Miller stood up and then turned back to the Jeep. He returned with 2 glass bottles, dark and sweating with condensation. He pushed them under the wire next to the plates. Coca-Cola. A mythical substance, a symbol of the decadent American world she was taught to despise. Lena didn't move. Her mind reeled, unable to process the scene. Her survival instincts, honed by years of war and deprivation, screamed that it was a trick. The food was poisoned. It was a joke, and as soon as she reached for it, they would pull it away and laugh. Hunger wore it with fear, a brutal civil war in her soul. She looked up at Sergeant Miller's face, searching for a hint of malice, a flicker of deceit. She found only weariness and something else. Pity? He simply gave her a short, almost imperceptible nod. An affirmation. "It's for you. Eat." That simple human gesture did what no order or threat could have done. It chipped away at the wall of her fear. Slowly, hesitantly, like a wild animal approaching a fire, she knelt down. Her trembling hands reached under the wire, her fingers closing around the warm metal of the mess kits. They were heavy. They were real.
The weight of the mess kits was astounding. Lena felt the warmth seep through the thin metal into her cold fingers, a warmth that felt like life itself. She backed away from the wire slowly, as if carrying a holy relic, her eyes never leaving the American sergeant. He watched her for a moment longer, then turned away and went back to his Jeep, dismissing the event as if it were nothing. To him, it was 2 hamburgers. To Lena, it was the entire world tilted on its axis. She turned and walked back into the darkness of the prisoner enclosure, back to her small group. The other women emerged from the shadows, their faces a mixture of awe and terror. They stared at the food as if it were an apparition. Ingrid's dull eyes widened, a spark of life returning to them for the first time in days. "Lena?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. Lena knelt and placed one of the mess kits in Ingrid's lap. The girl stared at the hamburger, at the glistening potatoes. She looked at Lena, then back at the food, her expression one of utter confusion. "Is it safe?" Greta asked, her voice tight with suspicion. "They could have done something to it." Lena looked down at her own plate. The smell was making her dizzy. The propaganda, the years of ingrained hatred, the stories of enemy treachery, it all swirled in her head. But then she looked at Ingrid, who was already picking up a piece of potato with shaking fingers. The primal need for survival had won. Lena picked up her hamburger. The bread was soft, impossibly so. She took a bite. The taste exploded in her mouth, savory meat, rich and fatty, the slight sweetness of the bread. It was so overwhelming, so far beyond the watery cabbage soups and stale, gritty bread she had lived on for years, that she nearly wept. It wasn't just food. It was a memory of another life. She ate slowly, deliberately, making it last. Beside her, Ingrid was devouring her meal with a silent, desperate intensity. Lena twisted the cap off one of the Coca-Cola bottles. It hissed. She had never tasted it before. She took a sip. The cold, sweet, bubbly liquid was a shock to her system. It was the taste of a different world, a world of abundance and ease she couldn't comprehend. They shared the second bottle among the other women, each taking a small, reverent sip. The food was gone in minutes, but its effect lingered. It was more than just calories filling an empty stomach. It was a seed of something else, an act of inexplicable kindness in a universe that had become relentlessly cruel. From that moment, the air in the camp began to change, subtly but perceptibly. The invisible barrier between the captors and the captives, once a wall of solid, impenetrable hatred, now had a hairline crack in it. The GIs had seen what their sergeant had done. Some of them grumbled, but others looked at the huddled prisoners with a new expression. The Germans, in turn, had witnessed an act that contradicted everything they had been taught. Their enemy was not a monolith of evil. It was made of individual men, and at least one of them was capable of compassion. Lena finished the last of her Coke, the sweet syrup a pleasant coating in her throat. She looked over the wire toward Sergeant Frank Miller. He was cleaning his rifle now, his movements methodical, his face illuminated by the light of a single lantern. He was just a soldier, caught in the same vast, grinding machinery of war as she was. He was an enemy, yes. He had likely killed men who wore the same uniform she did. But he had also chosen to feed a hungry girl. The world was no longer black and white. It was 1,000 shades of confusing, complicated gray. The future was a terrifying blank. They were prisoners, their country was in ruins, and their old lives were gone forever. But as she huddled with Ingrid, a warmth spreading through her body that came not just from the food, but from a renewed flicker of hope, Lena knew this was the story she would tell. Not the story of the battles, the retreats, or the surrender, but the story of a cold April night, a desperate question, and the unexpected gift of a hamburger and a Coca-Cola, an impossible act of humanity that proved even at the very end of the world that not everything was lost.